Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Bulko and today I'm going to do another quick start guide with the Wizard. So this is going to go through the first 3 levels of Wizard and how you want to potentially start your character to get a good build to get you through the first few levels and on to success towards the later parts of the game. So the Wizard is a spellcaster, and in terms of their role, I often play my wizards as more of a controller with a little bit of blasting, so they're really focusing on taking care of lots of smaller enemies or taking enemies out of the fight completely. They're not necessarily going to be my striker doing sustained damage throughout the fight, but they do have a little bit of power to finish off targets. So with that all said, let's take a look at the ability scores. I'm obviously using Gale right here as my de facto wizard. So these are some ability scores I would recommend for a base all-round solid build. So I'm a human, and that's important to note because that means I get access to shields and light armor on my wizard, which is not going to be true for every race. So depending on your race, you might have things look a little differently, but I have my 10 strength, 16 dex, 14 constitution, 16 intelligence, 10 in wisdom, and 8 in charisma. My wizard isn't going to be a very good party face and is not going to be great at persuading or intimidating or anything, and that's totally fine, but my dexterity and intelligence are high. This is going to give me some bonus AC as well as better dex saves, and it's also going to give me better initiative, which is really important on a controller. I want my wizard to go first as much as possible so that they can take advantage of having those high impact area of effect spells that take enemies out of the fight. I also want a pretty good constitution score because I want to maintain concentration on my spells, which is really, really important. And obviously intelligence is going to increase the difficulty of my saves. So it's going to make it so enemies resist my spells a little bit less. So it's really important to max this out as soon as possible. Notable feats that you're potentially looking towards as well are going to be the resilient constitution feat. So it might be worth it to bump one of these up to something like this. You could drop wisdom a little bit and bump up your constitution and take that later. You could also do that on a respec later on, depending on how you want to do things, but getting that constitution up a little bit higher is always great. You also could consider doing that through your ability scores at level 1, just putting your constitution to 16 instead of your dexterity and dropping this a little bit less. This becomes even more viable if you're playing a race like a Githyanki or a Shield Dwarf that has access to medium armor proficiency, because that way you're maximizing your armor class and you can avoid taking the mage armor spell as well. So that'll be really nice in terms of maximizing your AC, which having good AC also makes it so that you don't need to make as many concentration saving throws to begin with because you're just going to be hit less often. So that's also really nice. In terms of cantrips, do have options here. I like taking both Firebolt and Ray of Frost for the various utility. It is a Larian game, which means Firebolt has so many things to set on fire. There's powder kegs, grease, lots of little flammable bits and bobs, torches to light, things like that. So having Firebolt, I find, is just really nice to have. And then Ray of Frost obviously has a little bit of a slow to it. It does a little bit less damage than Firebolt, but still solid damage. And it also has the ability to sometimes knock enemies prone and freeze water. So there are other utility uses here. In terms of my third cantrip slot, I would say this is probably the most flexible depending on what you're looking to do. So if you really want a light source, you could use that here. You could take Minor Illusion if you want to be sneaking around and things like that. Or Mage Hand, I find, is actually useful in certain spots in the game with puzzles. Being able to press buttons and stuff from far away is kind of nice. So there is some use cases there. But I like Blade Ward. It is just a nice resistance for 2 turns. There are places where you're going to want to use this, but generally these are all going to be situational. You could even take something like Shocking Grasp if you want your wizard to be able to escape melee attackers too. So that's what I would recommend for cantrips. And in terms of your spells, this is a nice array that gives you all the options you need to be a decent controller right from the start, with a little bit of striking as well. So Magic Missile obviously is that single target or even multi-target spell that has no attack roll. It just does 2 to 5 damage per missile with 3 missiles. So this is amazing all throughout the game. It doesn't do a ton of damage, but it's guaranteed damage. And because you can always see the hit points of enemies, it's really, really useful. So at any point in the game, there's going to be those enemies with 2 or 3 hit points left, and you just send a missile at them. If they're at 4 or 5 hit points, you could send 2 at them and guarantee the kill. It's always going to make sure you finish those enemies off, and it's really, really useful. I'm never sad to have Magic Missile in my party. There's almost every fight, there's an enemy that just has that 1 HP that I want to finish off, and it's great for that. Shield is great as a reaction. Make sure you turn on the ability for reactions to be asked when to be used. This gives you 5 AC when you're getting attacked, and obviously you just use it when that 5 AC will turn a hit into a miss, and then it has great value there. It also lasts for the rest of the turn, so back until you take your turn again, and sometimes it'll prevent 2 or 3 hits from hitting you, and it can be really, really useful. It's also great for multi-classes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but Shield is a really, really useful spell. Grease has a ton of utility. It's a nice little control spell, really slows enemies down, and it also makes them fall prone potentially. There are going to be situations where you can knock enemies down, and if you look at the initiative and plan ahead of time, and you target an enemy that goes after your frontline gets to go, you could potentially give advantage to your frontline because they can get advantage when attacking prone enemies. So there's a little bit of a combo here, and you might not think about it, but it almost functions like a pseudo fairy fire that can grant your melee attackers advantage if you're making those enemies fall prone. Also, it works great as a kiting tool and a control tool, just putting it at a choke point and making enemies have to waste their whole turn getting to you. And it combos well with Firebolt to do a little bit of damage by letting it up all on fire on subsequent turns. So, fun spell. It is really creative and really fun to play around with. It is great. Sleep is, once again, a spell that doesn't require any rolling. It works on enemies up to 24 hit points, which is fantastic. So level 1 to 3, it's going to target plenty of things in various encounters, and even late game. Think of it almost like a magic missile in some senses. When that enemy has 20 hit points, you just put it on them. You're guaranteed taking them out of the fight for a couple of turns, and you can focus on clearing out the rest of the enemies. Also to note, enemies that are asleep will take a guaranteed critical hit from melee attacks. So this can be used to guarantee finish off an enemy because they'll also be having advantage to hit those enemies. So it really makes them easy to hit. It also should be noted that enemies' AI tend to focus on waking up sleeping enemies. So if you sleep an enemy that's way in the back line, the front line sometimes will turn around and run back to wake up that guy in the back line, and it functions as a sort of double crowd control in some situations. It just is important to also pay attention to the order of initiative so you're not wasting it by putting a target to sleep that's going to be woken up before they take a turn. Thunderwave is really fantastic. It's a huge knockback, does a good amount of damage. It guarantees half damage even if they make a save, so similar to Magic Missile. Sometimes enemies are low, and this will just guarantee finish them off, and it's really fun. It can hit multiple enemies. It can hit allies, so just be careful with that. And then Mage Armor is just almost like a wizard tax that you can pay if you don't want to have a race that gives you armor bonuses or the ability to wear armor in terms of armor proficiency. It'll give you that 13 base AC plus your dex. So with Mage Armor alone, with this build, if we have 14 in our decks, we'd get up to 15 AC at level 1, which is really solid. We could also even do something like this, where we go back here, and we can get up to 16 AC at level 1. And then because Gale's a human, he could also put a shield on, and that would be even better. And then we pop our shield spell, and we're up to 23 AC at level 1. Pretty tanky wizard. So obviously it's not going to be able to do that for very long, because that would be all of your spells for one round and not necessarily the best use of your spells. But there are some really cool things you can do in terms of defenses as well with a wizard. So just thought I'd go over that. Onward to level 2. So obviously at level 2, we're getting those hit point increases. We get another spell slot, which is great. We get some class features. This is going to be based on our subclass, so we won't talk about those quite yet. And then we get 2 new spells. So in terms of new spells, at level 2, you don't necessarily need to worry as much compared to other casters when acquiring spells, because you can get spells from scrolls as a wizard. But because we want to be a controller, I would recommend Fog Cloud and Tasha's Hideous Laughter as good pickups. But you're going to be able to get most of these spells eventually, and then it's just about which spells you want to have prepared. So this is a nice array in terms of spells giving you a wide variety of things you can do. I would maybe drop Thunder Wave for shield at level 2. Consider adding more later. You'll probably drop shield spell within the next few levels, put Thunder Wave back maybe, and then as you're getting second and third level spells, you're going to be dropping some of these as well. But this is a good array, gives you some nice AoE control here, some good defensives, and that ability to single target, finish enemies guaranteed. This is a nice mix I would like to use. But let's talk about the subclasses. So the subclasses are really, really cool. And these give you some unique abilities that are going to change the way your wizard feels. And each of these are paired to one of the schools of magic. But there are some that are maybe a little bit more nuanced than others. So evocation, this is the blastery magic. This is your fireballs, your lightning bolts, all your big booms. So if you want to be more of a blaster, this is a great way to go. So obviously you get the Savant feature, which is going to reduce evocation learning to 25 gold instead of 50. But you get the unique feature of sculpting spells. So this means whenever you cast an evocation spell, you no longer need to worry about allies being in the blast. So when we're talking about that Thunder Wave, for example, you can just blast away and it's not going to hit your allies. When you're throwing a fireball, you just center it on your party. You're not worrying about your allies. This is really, really useful for those blasters that just want to indiscriminately blast away. So you're not going to do any damage to your allies this way, and it is fantastic. So this is a great option. It's super solid for a blaster character. Not necessarily what we're going to go for with this build, but it is very good. Abjuration is a little bit more defensive. This is going to be for wizards that want to be a little bit tanky. Maybe there's some multi-classing here if you wanted to be a sort of a Gish build, so sort of a fighter wizard that wants to be in the front line. So you get this arcane ward, and the way it works is whenever you cast a spell, you get charges equal to the level of the spell, and then as you take damage, you have this ward which reduces the damage whenever you take it, and then it reduces the charge of your ward by 1. So as you're casting spells like shield and mage armor, you're charging up your ward, and then as you're taking damage, it goes down. So Abjuration wizards are just generally going to take a little bit less damage. They're going to have this buffer on them that prevents them from getting hurt, which is kind of nice. Necromancy is very popular, obviously. So once per turn, when you kill a creature, you regain hit points equal to twice the spell slot used, thrice if it's a necromancy spell. So if you're killing people with those necromancy spells, you're going to get some hit points back, or just regular spells will work as well. Now there's not a ton of necromancy spells early on. Early on, it's things like Ray of Sickness, which is a poison spell, which a lot of enemies aren't going to be super affected by. It is a con save as well, which most enemies do have really high constitution saving throws. So it's not going to be very effective. And unlike a lot of spells, you'll note this doesn't say it deals half damage when you miss. So, something like Burning Hands, targets still take half damage. Doesn't say that for Ray of Sickness. So if you miss, it does nothing, which I never like taking spell slots that do nothing when they don't happen. I prefer spells that are kind of guaranteed to work or have a high chance of working. Things like Fog Cloud, it works 100% of the time. It's always great. Spells like even Enhanced Leap works 100% of the time. So personally, I don't love Ray of Sickness, but Necromancy is pretty good later on. But right away at level 2, it's not doing much for you. Conjuration is pretty cool. So you get Create Water, which is a really useful spell. So we talked about combinations earlier with things like Grease. Well, getting enemies wet increases how much damage they take from lightning spells, which is awesome. And also it means you can make ice surfaces with Ray of Frost. There's also plenty of times when it'd be useful to douse things with water, and that can be really useful as well. So being able to create water with Conjuration is fantastic. Through enchantment, you get Hypnotic Gaze. So this is a single target melee ranged Hypnotic Gaze. And and you can maintain it to extend the duration. So this is really good for a controller, and enchantment spells in general are going to be really good for those like mind controlling type spells. So it is an interesting option there. It gives you another way to take an enemy out of the fight. Illusion has improved minor illusions, so this gives you a bonus action and it lets you remain hitting while casting the spell. The spell can be cast when you're silenced, so this is really good for like being that tricksy kind of obviously illusionist. And illusion spells are also really good for controllers. So this is kind of fun, especially the fact that this is a bonus action. It lets you cast other full spells and then do this as well. And you can help, group enemies together before you do a bigger crowd control when they're all grouped up. And then finally, transmutation gives you 2 alchemical solutions instead of 1 when you're combining. So you need to take medicine as one of your skills, or you probably should if you wanted to do this. It's really good. There's a lot of useful alchemy recipes in Larian games, so don't sleep on this. Compared to something like the tabletop where you're relying on your DM for crafting, Larian has a very defined rule set for how crafting works. So there is a benefit potentially for getting this as well. And finally, I did skip over it. You may have wondered that divination is one of my favorite schools, and I almost always take this when I make a wizard on the tabletop because the ability is just too good. So portent is essentially your character gets to see the future. So you get 2 random portent dice during the day, and you get to use your reaction to change the dice of any attack roll or saving throw near you to one of your portent dice. So what you're doing is you're rolling ahead of time, and you're getting 2 dice. And because you get to choose when, you can use it defensively or offensively. There's so many great ways to use this. So, for example, if you have a really high dice, you could guarantee a hit with a really powerful spell. So once again, you have a spell. Let's say you do have Ray of Sickness for whatever reason. You took it and you like it and you want to use it. You can guarantee that it'll hit your target by making sure that it has a high attack roll. This is a con save. So like the reverse of it rather is if you have a really low portent dice, you can guarantee the enemy fails their saving throw by saying, I'm going to use this against you, and they make their save, and then you use your reaction and say, actually, no, you rolled a 3. And that's what you get to do with the divine portents. You just get to say, no, this is actually what the dice said. You only get 2 of them, but they are incredibly powerful, and as a controller, it is amazing. Specifically, those low rolls, you're almost wishing for low rolls, because then you just point at the boss and said, yes, you did fail your saving throw on Tasha's hideous laughter. Enjoy. And you get to guaranteed take them out of a fight. And then at higher levels, obviously, when you're using something like Hold Person, and you're making them fail their saving throw, you get your front line in there, and they're just guaranteed critting them all over their place. It's fantastic. So this is definitely great for that controlling wizard that I want to play, that's going to absolutely take enemies out of the fight, and those portents are going to make sure my spells land, or it can make sure my allies are making their important saving throws or concentration checks or whatever it is. It will be asking you a lot if you want to use your portent dice potentially. So if you don't like that, and if you don't want to bother with that, maybe not the best, but I like portents, so I'm going to pick them. So Tasha's is my spell, and then I'm going to take Fog Cloud, and we'll go on to level 3. All right, level 3 is we get additional spell slots. So now we have some second level spell slots, which are great. We get to pick some second level spells now. So obviously, we can still pick first level spells, but I'm just going to frame this in that discussion around being that controlling character and that bit of a blaster as well. So I want to pick really high impact spells that are going to do damage over and over again or control a whole bunch of enemies. So for me, web is a fantastic spell. It's a really thick web that's flammable and it slows enemies. It's kind of like super grease in that way, but it also can enweb them if they fail their dex save. So in webbed enemies, they cannot move. they have advantage, or all your attacks will have advantage against them, and all their attacks are going to have disadvantage, and they also have disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. So it's really, really powerful debuff to in-web enemies. It's going to make all your archers and warlocks blasting them have a super easy time of hitting them, and they're going to do very little to you in return. It also really slows big groups down, and it covers a huge area. It has that 4-meter radius, which is massive. So I love web. The perfect spell for a controller. And then in terms of blasting, I love Cloud of Daggers. There's no saving throw. You just put it out. It has a fairly nice circle to target enemies. It lasts for 10 turns. It does 44 slashing damage the second you throw it down, and it does 44 damage the second they start their turn. So it actually does 8d4 damage, which is quite a bit of damage compared to some of these other spells that you would get. So Shatter does 3d8 damage, but 8d4 is a little bit better. So and it has potential to do even more than that, because there's times where you can just use your front line to shove them back in, or if you're doing a combo, you can cast web and then Cloud of Daggers right on top of them and they can't move. There's things like that you can do, so it's really useful. So I think these two spells are going to be absolutely fantastic. You could also do something with Flaming Sphere, because you can conjure this and it does damage repeatedly as well. You use your turn to smash the sphere into people, so it can kind of do that repeated damage. It's just not quite the same amount of damage as Cloud of Daggers. This is a little bit more mobile, and obviously it can light things on fire, which is really good. So in terms of being a controller, though, I think web is obviously the best second level spell you can get. There are some other good options in terms of hold person for that single target, and it does combine really well with the portent that we talked about, so guaranteeing they fail their save. But web at level 2 anyways, I find is better just because it can hit more targets. But as you get more spell slots, definitely hold person is one that we'd want to pick up right away. But we're a wizard, so we're just going to probably have all of these anyways. But in terms of ones you're going to want right away, those are the two I go for. So with that said, when it comes to which spells we want to prepare, I'd probably drop sleep at this point and do something like that. This gives me, once again, a nice variety. So I have single target, I have AoE damage, I have big AoE control, I have a lower level AoE control, I have my defenses still, and I'm feeling pretty good about my wizard right now. I'm going to be really useful in all sorts of combat encounters, and I do have the intelligence and the skills to be a specialist outside of combat as well, with my arcana and history and investigation checks. So that is the quick start guide for the wizard. Let's talk about some multi-class options. When it comes to multi-classing a wizard, there are a couple of standout options that I personally like, mostly in the fighter and the rogue, and specifically because both fighters and rogues have subclasses which also give you access to wizard spells. So rogues have Arcane Trickster and fighters have Eldritch Knight. And what I would generally recommend is either being a wizard with a few extra abilities from these, if that's what you're looking for as a bit of a combo, or being mostly a fighter, or at least half a fighter, and then taking wizard levels. So one thing to note in Baldur's Gate is wizards typically can only learn spells if they have the wizard level required to cast them. But in Baldur's Gate, the way wizards work is they can actually learn any spell that they have a scroll to if they have slots as a character. So it's a subtle difference, but essentially what it means is a level 3 fighter that's an Eldritch Knight with a level 8 wizard could potentially learn more spells than they otherwise would. I don't necessarily recommend doing that particular split, but if you went up to 5 levels of Eldritch Knight, so you could get your 2 melee attacks and then the rest into wizard, you would be sort of that hybrid Gish character. And specifically because you have wizard levels and you can learn any spell as you're progressing, as you're unlocking your spell slots, your spell casting would absolutely be behind a full caster wizard, but you'd have really powerful melee options, you'd have amazing armor, and you'd have way more spell slots than a pure Eldritch Knight. So your ability to maintain spells like Blur and Shield and all that kind of defensive option spells you could be an incredible tank. You'd be an amazing frontline if you went fighter and wizard as a combo. You'd want to start off, I would say, fighter for the first few levels, and arguably even your first 5 levels of fighter, and then go wizard. With Eldritch Knight at 3, you would have a few kind of wizard feeling things out of the way, and you could still even go for a dex-based build and be sort of a dex-based Eldritch Knight and use a rapier, and you can even wear heavier armor if you want, and it would be fine. I still like that maybe over some of the strength-based Eldritch Knights. Strength-based is fine because you're going to have plate mail and heavy armor and things like that, but I like the higher initiative, and I want my wizard to go fast because you still have those opportunities where if you can act at the start of combat, you're just going to throw out that web before enemies are up in your face, and it's going to completely change the course of the fight. Rogues, similarly, they have some opportunities. The only thing is rogues don't ever get access to multi-attack anyways, and you're potentially hurting yourself by multi-classing rogue wizard. It would give you a few extra spell slots, but you're losing sneak attack dice essentially. So there is a bit of a trade-off. I would only ever do a dip maybe for expertise and a few proficiencies. It is worth noting that if you went to level 3 and took something like Thief, you would get that extra bonus action, which having an extra bonus action as a wizard, there's potentially some fun things you could do, but then you'd be really behind on your spell progression. So not the most powerful combo, but it is pretty fun. In terms of other classes, you could look at something like Cleric or Druid as like a 1-level dip to give you access to different spells. And because these are full casters, you wouldn't even necessarily need to have the wisdom to use their spells effectively. You could just focus on picking spells that don't necessarily rely on using your casting stat, and then it would just augment your versatility as a wizard, which can be fine. But other than that, yeah, I don't have a ton of recommendations in terms of mixing and matching with a wizard. Paladin for Divine Smite potentially, but at the end of the day, you'd rather just be a Paladin sorcerer if you want that, if you want those arcane spells. So wizard, because they rely on intelligence, they tend to want to be mostly wizard. Fighter obviously is probably the most powerful dip because at second level you're getting action surge, you get second wind at level 1, which is kind of like a free potion. You get the weapon and armor proficiencies at level 1, which is going to make you a lot more tanky, and then you can become Eldritch Knight at level 3, which gives you a few extra spell slots, so you're not super far behind on your spell slot progression. And then at level 5, obviously the second attack, but you are really going to be mostly a fighter, and then you can start taking wizard levels, and then by like level 8 or 9, you'll be able to, like, you know, sling fireballs and attack in melee, and you'll be super tanky with shield and blur and things like that. So you'll start coming online a little bit more towards the end of the game, but it'll still be totally functional within the first few levels. You're just definitely going to play more like a fighter. And yeah, that is my overall quick start guide for the Wizard. The Wizard is a super fun and powerful class. I really like how much versatility you get through the subclass options of the Wizard. I didn't go into too much of that later stuff because there's just so much to talk about, but I love Divination. I love the Portents. They're super good. I recommend them no matter what you want to do with your Wizard, but obviously there's so much else you can do. And yeah, so thanks for watching. Once again, I appreciate all the comments, the likes, the subs. I'm still completely blown away by how many people are tuning in, and you are all amazing. I will catch you in the next one.